Oh, hello. Yeah, there we are. As I said, we're talking about technological step changes, and we just saw a step change taking
Mes
place.
kalbame apie technologinius pokyčius ir šiuo metu vyksta daugybė technologinių pokyčių taip pat. Ir mums reikia kalbėti apie rinką, situaciją rinkoje, paklausą ir pasiūlą. Ir tai turi įtakos visiems ekonomikos veiksmams. O per pastaruosius 12 metų naftos kainos kyla.
We have been positive to oil prices for almost 5 years when we changed our view on the market last year. We issued a report where we said oil prices are going to start drop to a lower fare compared to what we've seen the last and last year we issued this report, $116 in August. What has happened after that is basically the price is overshooting, undershooting, overshooting. But we're trying to say something about the average price. A little bit trouble with the microphone still, it seems. So the point is that we're trying to say something about the average price. And the average price this year is on track to come in at about $108, which is about $3 to $4 lower than last year. So this year will be probably only the third year of the last 15 years where the average price is dropping. So it seems to be correct to turn the view last year. And our message is that we're looking at a more stable market in the next, I would say, 5, 6, 7 years. Moving into this lower trading range, $80 to $100, a bit similar to what we saw from 1986 to 2003, where the mean reversion was more like $20 to $30. Stable market at the time. We're looking at a more stable market, the larger the share of shale oil hitting the market. That's the new oil coming from the US, which has to do with the technology steps that I was talking about. The key reason why we haven't dropped below $100 yet in oil prices is this picture. It's unplanned outages in the oil market. And the orange part here is Libya falling out of the market. That's the Arab Spring. Started in 2011, and after that we've lost a lot of barrels from Iran, green barrels, and right now today they're negotiating again between Iran and the world powers on the nuclear program in Iran. And of course, because of the embargo from Europe, oil embargo and financial sanctions towards Iran, more than 1 million barrels is out from that country. You add on Libya, which is almost not producing anything right now, and we have a lot of shut-out barrels. So if you look at the numbers here, we're at quite historically high levels. The only other periods where we can compare with that high levels is, the Iraq War and also the breakup of the Soviet Union, which came together with the first. You have to ask yourself, should we continue to see this kind of delta in unplanned outages? We've lost 2.5 to 3 million barrels per day out just the last 2-3 years. And comparing that with shale oil production in the US, you can see this is showing the new oil to the market from the US, only from 4 states. It's Texas, North Dakota, Oklahoma, and New Mexico. So now we have 2.5 million barrels of shale oil hitting the market from the US. And the only reason why this hasn't pushed down the oil price, or it has pushed it somewhat down, but not below 100, is because when you put the unplanned outages, the delta, they're even higher. But you have to look at the future here, and do you think that we will continue to lose 2 million barrels in 2-3 years, and we think that won't happen. We think these lines are going to cross. So that means shale oil production will continue to increase, maybe not in the same pace as we have seen in 2012 and 13, but they will still increase 600,000 to 800,000 barrels per day the coming 5-6 years. but we don't think that the delta in unplanned outages will continue. So these are going to cross. And that means Saudi Arabia will have to decide, are they going to back production? Going to go for market share? Is that better, using that one maybe? Hello? Hello? I'll just strip off the other equipment. Hello? Yeah, that's better. So they have to choose, going for market share or price. And it's not written in stone what they're going to choose there. Had we not seen these unplanned outages, we would have already seen a test of OPEC as a cartel the last 2 years. And it will be very important now in 2014 what happens to the barrels from Iran and from particularly Libya. But we also have shut out barrels in other parts of the world, as you just saw on the prior graph, Nigeria and Syria and so forth. So let's look at the big trends. I'm going to talk a little bit about the demand side and then on the supply side afterwards. On a global scale, this picture shows what happened to global oil demand going back to 1965. So you can see we entered the 1970s with this kind of trend line demand growth for oil. It was 5 to 6% year-on-year growth for oil. Then we had 8 out of 10 years of rising prices in the 70s, and we had 2 oil price shocks. And of course that did something to demand. So we had a big recession in the early 80s, oil demand fell 10%, and we started a new era of rising oil demand, but then the trend line demand growth was permanently damaged. So we were stuck with about 1.7%, almost linear growth for several decades. Now we're falling off from that trend again. So we think that instead of seeing 1.7% year-on-year growth, we rather expect about 1% growth for oil demand in the coming years. Because not all this weaker demand here is cyclical. Part of this is structural. And it has to do with the fact that oil prices have been running away from the price of other energy sources. And the long period of rising prices is starting to change people's behavior as well. One of the key themes that could change the whole energy mix is, of course, other energy sources. We see solar, we see wind, we see renewables coming into the market. It's growing about 15% per year right now on a global scale. And maybe solar is the best example of how difficult it is to predict how the energy mix is going to look like in 2030 or 2035. Because if you look at the cost for installed solar modules, it was 4.2 euros per installed watt 13 years ago. Then it took about 8 years to cut that in half. Then it took just 3 years to cut that in half again. And then it took just 1 year to cut that in half again. So this is very unpredictable. We have a PhD at our desk back in Oslo in solar energy. And he took his PhD in 2008. So then, you know, the cost was up here at 2.1. And he said, yes, we thought the cost would continue to drop, but maybe reach this level around 2030. Now we're already there. So this means if solar can compete with the other energy sources, of course, there's enough solar. If you can capture the energy from the sun, it'll be enough to cover the world's energy needs for hundreds of years. So it's just a matter of doing that economically. And that's why it's possible to say something about the energy mix maybe 3, 4, 5 years down the road, but talking 2030, 2035, extremely difficult. Back to oil. Oil's market share was almost half the market in the 80s. Then it dropped 10%, and we got down to a stable market share because then the oil price was stable for about 15, 16 years. $20 to $30 per barrel mean reversion. Then the oil price started rising again, and oil lost market share again. So oil has lost about 5% market share in the energy mix the last 10 years. And what's taking that market share is basically coal. So you see this graph here is showing the market share of coal gaining about 5% the last 10 years. This is, of course, not a good thing for the global CO2 emissions. And it's happening a lot, of course, in China and in emerging Asia, the extra usage of coal. And why is this happening? Well, as I said, oil prices have been running away from the prices of other energy sources. This is the oil price, the thick red line. Up here is LNG to Japan, here is LNG to Germany, and here you have the NBP gas price in the UK. All these other ones at the bottom here, they're coal prices. So no wonder why people are rather using coal than other energy sources. So even Japan has been ramping up their usage of coal. And of course Europe is using more coal, and the US is using less because they have much cheaper natural gas. So ironically, the US CO2 emissions are going down, the European CO2 emissions are going up. Because market forces, not because of politics. Of course, politics makes matter as well, because had we had a price on carbon, this would probably not have happened. So right now the energy mix looks like this. You know, oil is on its way down, coal is on its way up, natural gas a little bit increase, hydroelectric power is the blue line, nuclear is the gray one, and you see renewables starting to come up from a very low base, rising about 15% per year, as I said. And if you take the last 5 years and extrapolate the trends, it's looking like this. This is not a forecast. This is just saying what happens if the current trends continue. And as you can see, oil will then continue down, and coal will be gaining another 10%. So that the fact, if renewables increase like this, it won't be a good environmental development if coal increases another 10%. But I think what's going to happen is that natural gas is going to take a much larger market share. I don't think this is going to happen. Coal will not increase like this because I think natural gas, this part will start rising. And we see some very large structural changes going on in the two key markets, US and China. So in the US, things are happening because of market forces. This is the price of natural gas, the green line here, and the other line is the price of oil. No one else has this kind of price spread. And of course, if you rather can use natural gas instead of using oil, you would try and do that with that kind of price differential. And we see people starting to invest now in this spread. It has now been in place long enough to see the big players coming in. And we're starting to see, for example, new car models entering the market that can run on natural gas. This is the Chevy Impala. That will be the first sedan running on natural gas in the US. It will be hitting the market late 2014. This car is the Ford F-150 pickup truck. It's the most sold car in the US history. That will hit the market next year, running on compressed natural gas. But the big thing is probably not going to happen in the personal vehicle space, because Americans only use like 4, 5, 6% of their disposable income on fuel. They use more on entertainment. They use more on eating out. So it's not like make or break for their budget if they run on natural gas or gasoline. But on the trucking side, the heavy-duty trucking, it's different. This is showing where the traffic is in the US highways. And the good thing on the heavy-duty trucking is you don't need that much infrastructure in place to start using natural gas. So, and that's why you see companies like Chesapeake, you see Royal Dutch Shell, you see ENN Energy expanding the infrastructure for LNG filling stations. This is the plans for for clean energy to expand their LNG filling stations. And you can already go coast to coast on LNG on a heavy-duty truck in the US. So that's liquefied natural gas. And it's also interesting to note that Royal Dutch Shell, who is known to most people as an oil company, they're expanding, they're participating in this, and they're launching a global cooperation with Volvo Trucks. Why are they doing that? Aren't they an oil company? Won't that be cannibalizing their key product? But the thing is, for the first time in Royal Dutch Shell's more than 100-year-long history, they're producing more natural gas than coal, than oil, I mean. And that's the same way for most of the oil majors. They're becoming natural gas companies rather than oil companies. In fact, if you look at the big super majors, the 8 largest private oil companies, they're only producing about 11% of the global liquids production. And they used to produce 15% just 4 years ago. So they're very quickly becoming gas companies. So they have incentives to do a bit like Rockefeller did in the early 1900s. He handed out oil lamps for free to generate demand for his products. So this is an investment by Royal Dutch Shell to try and expand the usage of natural gas into the transportation sector. And the economic incentives are so much larger on the trucking, heavy-duty trucking, because with this new engine hitting the market this year from Westport Cummins, 11.9-liter engine, you can earn back that extra investment of $40,000 more to buy an LNG truck compared to a diesel truck. You earn that back with about 1 year of driving. And that's quite compelling when the lifetime of such a truck can be 8 to 10 years. And these guys, of course, have most of their cost in fuel. So we think that currently, you know, the demand for diesel in the US is about 2.5 million barrels per day. And that can basically be replaced by natural gas. 2.5 million barrels per day, that's more than Brazilian oil production, and it's more than Norwegian oil production, just to put things in perspective. In addition, there's an even larger momentum in China for moving their heavy-duty trucking over towards natural gas. And that has to do with pollution levels mainly. Not because of the invisible CO2 emissions, but because of local pollution that you can see in the cities. So these 3 graphs are showing pollution levels in 3 large Chinese cities. When you're above this line, it's unhealthy to stay outdoors. And half of the time, it's unhealthy to be outdoors. If you actually surpass the 300 level, which is up here, it's hazardous to stay outdoors. Had that happened in the US city, people would have just been told, don't go out. And that's why the Chinese government they're lifting environmental issues higher on their priority agenda. And you've seen this, you know, when people are not even able to see if there's a green light or a red light at the other side of the road, something needs to happen. And actually, the expansion of LNG filling stations in China, it rose of almost 30% just in the 3rd quarter, going from 1,300 stations to 1,700 stations just the last 3-4 months. And you might have noted that the IEA released its World Energy Outlook just last week. They were writing about 800 LNG filling stations in that report for 2012. Now we're already at 1,700. It has doubled already from what that report was using as a data point, and it was released last week. So this momentum is enormous. So I think natural gas is going to grab a lot of market share into transportation within the next, well, by 2020. Another thing that's happening is that for the first time we see improvements in US car efficiency. We don't have to wait anymore. We've been waiting for this for decades, but now it's starting to become visible. The US car fleet is becoming more efficient. And this is important because US gasoline demand is half of US oil demand. US gasoline demand alone is the same size of total Chinese demand for all oil products. So that's why it's important to note that the US government is rising the requirements, the so-called corporate fuel average efficiency standards, the requirements for the car manufacturers, just starting to rise. And the next 13 years, these dotted lines are the new requirements. And this is the largest part of the oil market we're talking about here. There's no other parts of the oil market that is larger than this single point. 9 million out of about 75 million barrels per day of refined product demand globally. We see other structural changes as well. This thick line is showing the population in the US. This other line is the total driven length, the vehicle miles driven in the US. That should increase when the population increases, because when the population increases, the car fleet is expanding. But we've seen here that since about 2004, 2005, it doesn't happen anymore. Why is this happening? Because if you translate to per capita, you can see that this didn't peak in the recession in 2009. It actually peaked in 2004, 2005. At this point. And you know, we had a very strong economic growth in the US in 2004, 5, 6, 7, partly into 8. But still, the driving per capita had started falling. So something else is going on other than just pure cyclical issues here. Number one, young people are answering very differently to car ownership than before. They answer that they would rather have internet access than owning a car, for example. And the fact that we had the first smartphone entering the market in the summer of 2007, that's when the iPhone was launched, that has changed particularly young people's behavior. They don't need to own a car to stay in touch anymore. Stay in touch on the internet through Facebook and Instagram and Twitter and all these programs. And at the same time, we see that the baby boomers, the so-called the high birth rates after the Second World War, they are now approaching pensioner age. What happens when you approach pensioner age? You drive a lot less. And that's also now starting to play into the US market. So I think we should probably not expect to go back to this growth in total driven length. So these factors combine to see that gasoline demand in the US will probably trend lower in the coming years, despite the fact that we expect better economic growth in the US than consensus. Because we think US has this cheap energy now that it will create millions of jobs and a lot of good opportunities for their economy. Now, we're not saying that oil demand is going to drop. It's going to drop in the OECD, not globally. It's going to drop in the US, in Europe, Japan, but not globally because of this picture. Most people in the world live inside this circle. Asia has about 60% of the world population. And actually these 15 countries are alone 54% of the world population. Here people are still being lifted from poverty towards the middle class. And we still see population growth. We still see urbanization. So if you look at the UN forecast for population growth, This is their 3 scenarios, and even the weakest one see no peak in population growth until about 2040. So the next 10 years we will still see population growth, and right now on urbanization we're about 50% of the world lives in cities, and that's expected to rise to about 61%. That's the UN scenario here, 61% by 2030. So urbanization creates extra energy demand per capita, while population growth, almost by definition, creates higher economic growth, which again creates more demand for energy. So these 2 factors combined will still lead to extra energy demand. The problem for oil is that most of this extra energy demand will come in the form of electricity generation, extra demand for electricity. And oil is not going to be the winner in that mix. It will be other energy sources that will be behind the growth in generation of electricity. So non-OECD oil demand, yes, it's still growing. As you can see, this is the demand for oil in the non-OECD, but we're falling off a bit from the trend line. We're not growing 5 to 8% anymore, like we've seen in many periods after the change of the millennium. We're now more like 3 to 4% year-on-year growth. And a lot of people have said that oil prices have gone from $25 to $100, and still oil demand keeps rising in the non-OECD. So they say that means the demand for oil is inelastic versus the price. But the problem is you can't do that analysis already now, because most of these countries, they are subsidizing the oil usage. So the price, the global oil price, has not been hitting on the consumers. And interestingly, if you look at the news flow the last 4, 5, 6 months, several countries in this, inside this circle that I pointed out to you, they can't afford it anymore. It's become too expensive. Maybe the best example is Indonesia. They had to remove subsidies on the 22nd of June. Suddenly, consumers are met with 20% and 40% higher prices for gasoline and diesel. Of course, then you can start to do the sensitivity analysis. And these countries are large, as I said. If you look at India, Indonesia, Malaysia, you know, Indonesia spends 14.5% of their state budget on petroleum subsidies. They can't afford it anymore. It's become too expensive. India has also started throttling back on their subsidies. They spend almost 7% of their budget on petroleum subsidies, direct subsidies, buying in expensively globally products and selling them cheaply domestically. And Malaysia also, 6% of their budget. These countries are behind. So you see India here at 3.4 million barrels per day, for example. These 3 countries are behind 6 to 7% of global oil demand. I'm not saying that demand is going to start falling in these countries, but the growth will be weaker when suddenly the consumers are met with a higher oil price. This is just starting to happen. The key is, of course, China. China has been behind 40% of global oil demand growth the last 10 years. And this is Chinese demand here. You can see that we're falling off from the trend line growth in China as well. The last point that we have is now 9.6 million barrels per day for September. And at the end of last year, we were up here. So you can see 10.3 million barrels per day. So the November and December will be very tough comparison for China. We had negative demand growth for China in September. We'll probably have positive for October, but November and December can be very tough year on year. That means it could create some headlines when suddenly Chinese oil demand becomes suddenly negative at the end of the year, year on year. The Chinese government has said we have to tilt our consumption more towards, our economic growth more towards personal consumption rather than investment growth. And we see that playing out in the oil data as well. This is gasoline demand performing well. Still, car sales, 20 million per year now, annualized. US is about 15. So that means China, a couple of years ago, surpassed the US as the largest car market in the world. So gasoline demand is growing decently, but note, it's only 2 million barrels per day. Gasoline demand in the US is 9 million barrels per day. And so this has been behind about 20% of the growth in China. The key petroleum product in China the last 10 years has been diesel. That's where we've seen most of the growth in oil demand in China. And this is diesel demand in China. Has stopped growing, basically. The last 2.5 years, there's no growth in China in diesel demand. So this line here, you can see, has not been rising at all. We're still stuck at about 3.5, 3.6 million barrels per day. And the thing is, when you build a new Manhattan, you spend a lot of diesel. But they're not going to build that many new Manhattans anymore. The investment part of the Chinese economic growth will not be as large as it was. And in the total economic growth also in China is set to be more like 7 to 8% rather than the 10% plus. Our macroeconomists expect about 6% GDP growth in China. And that growth will be less energy intensive than what we have seen the prior 10 years. So you get a double whammy for diesel. In addition, you see competition coming in from other energy sources because diesel is not only used for transportation in Asia. A lot of diesel is used for power generation, industrial production, and heating as well. Stationary usage of oil. So now you see wind coming in here. If you translate to oil equivalents, almost 1 million barrels per day now, coming from about 0 just 6-7 years ago. I don't think anyone would have been able to predict this kind of development for wind in China. And they're also expanding on solar. They'll be building about 50 gigawatts installed solar by 2015. And they're expanding on nuclear as well. So this is starting to compete into the stationary oil sector. And that's why I don't expect China to increase by 500,000 barrels per day every year anymore. In oil demand, probably more 0.3, 0.4 million barrels per day. Still growth, just a little bit weaker growth than what we've seen. Now, to an equally important matter, the supply side. Now we're over to the US oil production, because this would not have happened, this development exploding to the upside, had we not seen the oil price rising. At $50 oil, this development would not have been materializing. So the US is up about 2 million barrels per day the last 2 years. That's the same as a new Brazil to the market in just 2 years. And the surprise has been massive, because if you look at the IEA forecast, in the summer of 2011, about 2 years ago, they thought US oil production would rise 45,000 barrels per day. In 2012, it came out at 1 million. So they missed by more than 2,000% in a forecast that was made half a year before the year started. That's probably the largest miss ever that the IEA has made on their any forecast. And for 2013, they've been missing about 100%. That's the red line, from about 400-500 to now expecting more than 1 million this year as well. Next year, still growing in their estimates. So we have about 1.6 million barrels per day of new oil to the market, compared to what the IEA expected just 2.5 years ago. So that's the largest upside surprise in the history of oil. So this is the revolution in shale production in the US, and the reserves estimates are quite enormous. This is from Pyra Energy, the consultancy that we are using. We bought into a report, a study on this issue last year, which was published in September in Houston. So their estimate is 113 billion barrels recoverable crude oil from shale formations in the US. And it's mainly North Dakota up in the Bakken field, and it's the Permian Basin and Eagle Ford in Texas. Most of production is expected to come from just those 2 states. And the interesting thing is, it's mainly on privately held lands, which means that it's regulated by the state of North Dakota and it's regulated by the state of Texas. It's not regulated by the federal government. So that means these guys, these states, will not choke off that development because it's enormously positive for their economies. There's almost no unemployment, for example, in North Dakota. And Texas is booming. So there's no reason why these states should try and regulate this industry to lower growth rates, basically. This is a global issue, of course. It's not only the US who has shale resources. The largest resource holder is estimated to be Russia. This is from a Department of Energy report issued in June this year. That's the first global assessment on shale oil reserves. This is not shale gas, this is shale oil. 345 billion barrels is the estimate, and they haven't even tried to look at the Middle East and the Caspian region. They don't have had data to look at to assess the levels. But if anyone has shale resources, it must be Saudi Arabia. But there's no reason why they should start extracting that as long as they still have cheaper projects to run. But of course, this is a global issue. I have not assumed that this will hit the market by 2020 from Russia or Argentina or China. But after 2020, it should be coming to the market if the oil price is not collapsing. But so to me, what's happening in the US and Canada alone is enough to see a global impact of the oil price, because demand or imports to the US has started to drop to around 8 million barrels per day. And I think it's going to be cut in half by 2020, down to around 4 million barrels per day. And then you could ask, if this materializes, will it have a global oil price effect? And I think, yes, it will, because these barrels will then be available to others. It will be available to Asia to feed further growth in Asia. It will be available to Europe to fight the decline rates we have in the North Sea. So that's how the global impact is starting to come in. And interestingly, just the last 2 months, we see this playing out. This is the differential between oil in Asia, represented by Dubai, that's the benchmark, key benchmark in Asia, versus Mars, which is one of the Gulf Coast grades for medium sour crude in the US Gulf Coast. You can see the 5-year average is up here, the blue line. And now suddenly US Gulf Coast crude oil is trading $17, $18 cheaper than Dubai. This happened in just the last 3 months. Why should the US continue to import then, when they have much cheaper domestically produced crude? Reaching the Gulf Coast because they have expanded their pipeline system. So the bottleneck has moved now from the Midwest down to the Gulf Coast, basically, and then the Gulf Coast price is starting to collapse. The same if you compare with the Brent markets in Europe, with the Louisiana Light Sweet, the Light Sweet benchmark in the US Gulf Coast. Now, Brent is pricing $10 to $12 more expensive than US light sweet crude oil in the Gulf of Mexico. That has never happened before. Normally, you can see the blue line is the 5-year average. So Louisiana Light Sweet should price more expensive than Brent. But now everything is turned on its head. This will initiate that the US will start pushing away imports. They won't be incentivized to import when they have this kind of price differential. However, I'm not saying that we're going to go back to cheap oil. We're not going back to $20, $30 oil price. And the key reason is that these new resources hitting the market, they are not cheap. They're quite expensive to extract. This is the break-even prices for many of the plays in the US. So you need $70 to $90 to continue to see investments in this industry. The key plays are, of course, Eagle Ford here in Texas. You have the Bakken here in North Dakota, and this is the break-even price required to continue to see investments. And you have the Permian Shale in Texas. So if the oil price drops to $50, people will stop drilling. And because decline rates are so high in this industry, production will then start to drop. But the big question is, yes, it costs maybe $70 to $90 now, but what will it cost, let's say, 10 years down the road, or even 5 years down the road? Will the cost go up, or will the cost go down? And of course, the learning curve is very early. This is the contribution per rig in the Bakken. You can see it's moving from 2,000 to 5,000 barrels per working rig. This is just showing the learning curve, efficiency coming in. So if you count the rigs in the Bakken, you know, we were used to see this development, more and more rigs, higher and higher production. Then suddenly, fewer and fewer rigs. That's happened the last year. What's happening to production? Production is still moving up. So when people saw this, that we were turning the corner here, a lot of people expected production to start dropping. But it hasn't. It has continued to rise because the learning curve is still going on. But if you look at the snapshot today, these barrels are among the most expensive globally. So if you look at the cheapest ones, they will be conventional Middle Eastern barrels. Break even in this range from 20 to, well, basically $40. Then more and more expensive, and you see shale oil is the second most expensive. You only have the tar sands, which will be Canadian oil, and Venezuela heavy Orinoco oil. That's more expensive. And probably also Arctic barrels will be up there, and some biofuels, and gas to liquids and coal to liquids. But that means shale oil is second highest up, and that is supportive of the oil price, of course, because if we drop too low, you will have this picture. This is the monthly additions to production in the Bakken in North Dakota, and you have 81% decline for each field during the first 3 years of production. So if you stop drilling any new wells, this is going to happen to production. It's going to be cut in half by just 2 years. This is something new in the oil market. This is a safety valve that we have not had before. We have been used to trust on Saudi Arabia to cut back on production if necessary. So this will create barrels able to enter the market quickly and leave the market very quickly from non-OPEC. We have been used to trust on OPEC to do that. Now, suddenly, because of economical factors, non-OPEC can come in as a regulator of this. And that's why I'm saying the oil market should be more stable, because we don't have to use lead times of 8 to 10 years from investment to production anymore. If you invest in a well in the shale oil industry, you have production next year. So this, you can almost call this just operational cost, basically. Creates a lot of flexibility for an oil producer who's involved in this industry, because if the oil price drops, he can cut his costs immediately. He just stops drilling. So this creates flexibility. On top of that, it's not only economical calculations we have to look at. You probably have to add some geopolitical price premium from the Middle East, maybe $5 to $15 on top of any economical calculation, because we don't think the Arab Spring is over. We see the demographics in this region is very specific and different from the Western world. What you see here is the Middle East, North Africa, up in the right corner. Unemployment very high, youth unemployment extremely high, so no one else is worse placed. You have these blue countries, means there's more males than females. You have an extremely young population. Yemen is down here at 17 years of median age. It's almost incredibly low. Norway is at 40 years. Germany is at 40 years. Japan is at 45 years. And the world median age is 29. So, of course, you have a population consisting of young, unemployed males. That's what you have in this region. And when information has started to flow, opening up, you have the internet, you have the cell phone usage, satellite TV, information is starting to move, and these countries fall down into this J-curve. Country stability decreases. That's exactly where countries like Syria, Libya, Algeria, these countries are placed. Egypt as well. So we shouldn't expect a calm next 5 years from these countries. Something will happen. So based on this, we have this forecast of still a fairly high oil price, but somewhat lower than what we have seen, trending down to $90 per barrel in 2020. But the key issue to take away is not the levels, it's just the direction. We think directionally we will see a somewhat weaker oil market the next 5 years, and a bit more stable oil market as well because of the shale crude. Okay, with that, I thank you for your attention, and we'll take some questions later.